Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My apologies for arriving late. I went to RUSI. I am programmed to do that and didn't realize this meeting was taking place in the august surroundings of Church House. And my particular apologies to Alan Mallinson, because I arrived as you were about halfway through and I cursed myself for not having heard all of your eloquent presentation. Yes, I am the old generation. I'm the ancient Jurassic remnant of a previous Foreign and Commonwealth representation. I listened to Mark White with very great interest, because in the Foreign Office of my day, you would never have heard any senior official, whether from the FCO, from the MOD, DFID, though DFID didn't exist in those days. It was the good old days when overseas aid was under the control of the Foreign Secretary, and we had a bit of strategy in what we were doing. I would never have heard a presentation like that. And I actually come to the podium blinking, wondering, where am I? Is this a dream? Because so far, while I've been standing here, I'm sitting here, I haven't been sitting here very long, I haven't heard once the phrase national interest. And I think to myself, what the hell is persistent engagement? What does it mean? Does it mean waiting for a very long time to marry your fiancé? Or what is this stuff? What is this stuff? I'm very glad Alan actually used the phrase I did recognize, thank the Lord. You made me feel part of the community here, because he said special relationship. And I actually have to tell you, because I can see a number of American uniforms here, and I'm really pleased to see them, particularly as I'm an honorary citizen of the state of Texas, and have a scroll hanging up in my kitchen to prove the fact. I'm not suggesting that you're all Texans, but I'm sure there must be one of you here. When I arrived at the embassy in Washington, it's got nothing to do with persistent engagement at all. When I arrived in Washington on Halloween 1997, one of the first invitations I received was from the U.S. Marine Corps. Are there any U.S. Marines here? Yeah, excellent. There you are, sir. And it was to mark Trafalgar Day. And a very small bulb went on in my brain. I thought, hang on a minute. Battle of Trafalgar, British Navy, against the French and the Spaniards. Is the American Navy there? Hang on a minute. Don't think so. Might have been a few Americans pressed into Her Majesty's service. No doubt quite a few. I don't remember the Americans being there. So I went to the U.S. Marine Corps, and there's wonderful evening of hospitality and celebration of Napoleon, Jesus Christ, of Nelson as a leader, and the U.S. Navy was there as well, the Royal Navy was there, the Royal Marines were there, and I said to the senior admiral present, I said, why have you got Nelson, and why haven't I got Nelson? And he said, well, this is all part of the special relationship, you're so generous. Anyway, I made a formal application to the U.S. Marine Corps, and we got Nelson and Trafalgar Day back to the British Embassy in 1998, and there it stayed, at least during my tenure, though knowing the United States, they probably recaptured it again and taken it back down to the U.S. Marine Corps barracks. Why am I telling you this? Because I just find it quite amusing. Now, and actually the way we kept U.S. admirals behind having Trafalgar Day in the British Embassy was, first of all, we had beating retreat every time on the lawn of the embassy, and Royal Marines came over to do this. And secondly, I was advised by a U.S. Navy captain to ensure enormous supplies of malt whiskey. And I brought it all malt whiskey of all types in, and the 30 American admirals who came to this dinner for 135 people would then sup on my malt whiskey contentedly after dinner. Now, that's kind of back to basics. So, what the message I really wanted to get over today, thinking about persistent engagement, and not being a member of the armed forces, but having observed diplomatically a number of wars, is I don't care what you call it, persistent engagement, big banana, whatever, but the key lesson for me of the last 40 years is that military means and political objectives are in synchronization, are in harmony, so that when you put British armed forces, as the Americans would say, in harm's way, you know strategically and politically why you are doing so. And some of those key components have been missing recently, and I would submit, as far as ISIS is concerned today, is missing right now as we speak. The first war I had to deal with up close up was when I was in the British Embassy in Moscow, and the Falklands War broke out in 1982. This seemed to me a war of pellucid clarity. The Argies had taken the Falkland Islands. We had to drive them out and take them back. There was no argument about what we were up to strategically or politically. That was the objective. So there was a profound clarity about the transmission belt between the expeditionary force we sent to the Falklands and the outcome we wanted, and we, thank God, succeeded in getting. And while I was in Moscow, every 4 days, I would be summoned to the Soviet Foreign Ministry and had a strip torn off me for intercepting their innocent trawlers in our waters around the islands, of course, bristling with antenna, and they weren't there just to listen to Radio Moscow, I can tell you. And as we would go to, this is another story, as we would go to the lifts of the Soviet Foreign Ministries, I could take my leave, clutching this protest, written protest in my hand. The head of the Second European Department, Mr. Vladimir Suslov, would whisper in my ear something like, "When are you going to drive those bastards into the sea?" And that's realpolitik for you. That's terrific, terrific stuff. And then we fast forward to 1991, Saddam Hussein invades Kuwait, seizes Kuwait, incorporates it into the state of Iraq. We go to war. It's pretty uncontroversial. You don't go around seizing other people's countries, by and large. And the strategic objective of the military operation was, to me, unutterably simple and plain. He'd taken a country, we had to get it back, restore its sovereignty, and put him back in his box. And so we did. And there was very little debate about means and ends. Everything was very, very clear. There was an argument, of course, about, at the very end of the war, after Saddam had been defeated and Kuwait retrieved, about whether we should go on to Baghdad and topple Saddam himself. And wisely, that was decided against. And do you know who was one of the most articulate exponents of the argument against going to Baghdad? It was then the American Secretary for Defense, Dick Cheney. And I commend to you, you'll find it somewhere on Google, his statement on this point. It could not be more eloquent, and was, of course, something he completely forgot a few years later. And then it's after these two very clear wars, the Falklands and the Gulf War I, Iraq I, whatever you want to call it, we then get into a kind of fudge. We get into the fudge area. And the first area of fudge is Afghanistan, where after 9/11, we decide to take out the Taliban government and destroy Al-Qaeda as a functioning force in Afghanistan. And that always seemed to me, and I was fully in favor of that always seemed to me to be a kind of 20th century version of the 21st century version of a 19th century punitive expedition on the northwest frontier, on which Winston Churchill reported so eloquently to the Daily Telegraph at the end of the 19th century. And that seemed to be a perfectly reasonable thing to do, a punitive expedition. Had a smell of the 19th century. What was wrong with that? More and more, I look to the 19th century for sound, wise, and basic precepts of foreign policy and foreign intervention overseas, where there seems to have been much more wisdom at the top than there is now, dare I say. And then, when you think of all those years we were in Afghanistan, longer than the two world wars of the 19th century put together, and you think to yourself, what actually was the strategic objective? What was the political objective? Well, first of all, it was quite clear that the long-term objective was to stop Al-Qaeda as a functioning movement in Afghanistan forever, so it could never have a base there. Al-Qaeda didn't seem to mind much because they just moved off to other countries. Then there was something about stopping the poppy crop and replacing it with lettuces or cabbages or something like that, which was a total signal failure. And then it became nation building. And then it became, how do you transform governance in a way that government in Kabul and the provinces start to, I'm going on too long, 2 minutes, start to reflect a number of Western principles. And at that point, we were lost. We were lost. Because the transmission belt, the connecting rod between those impossible goals related to governance and culture bore no relation to what we were trying to do with far too few forces, I'm talking about the UK now, in Helmand province. I see General Dannett sitting down there, and my knees start to knock as I move into the field of the military. But I seem to remember that in Northern Ireland, we considered Sinn Féin to be such a challenge that we had 150,000 troops there. In Helmand province, I know it was significantly less. So how the hell were we supposed to achieve anything there when we found ourselves actually fighting the great-grandsons of those who'd given us a kicking in the Second Afghan War? Iraq, we had a political goal there, but it wasn't connected to the military means. The political goal was never to make Iraq a fiefdom of Iran, which to all intents and purposes it has become. It was never to to overthrow the Sunni ascendancy and replace it with a Shia ascendancy that the country is now riven between the two big sects of Islam. So back to basics. I've got 10 seconds left. If we're going to talk about things like permanent engagement, if we're going to talk about Mark White's really interesting stuff about how we're trying to link everything up and do all that, there are prior questions that have to be decided. What is the political goal of any use of military power, and is it attainable? And there's an even bigger prior question, which very rarely is addressed in the open today: what is the national interest? Thank you very much.